My name is Avinash Persaud. I'm the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Investment and Financial Services. And recently, in the past couple of years, I'm also her Special Envoy for Climate Finance. When people ask me about the Bridgetown initiative, they ask, what's in it for me? What's in it for Barbados? And I think there's plenty in it for Barbados. I think it's a plan, or a key component of the plan is about building resilience to a changing climate. And for a changing climate for us, we see that in rising sea levels. Sea levels will rise by about 3/4 of a meter as climate change continues. We see it in a drier dry season and a wetter wet season, as big impact on our agricultural production, on flooding and drainage. The Bridgetown Initiative will provide cheaper access to cheaper finance for us to build resilience to these things. But I also think the question misses the point a little, because climate is a bit like pandemics. It's not something that individual countries can do on their own. We can't carve out a part of the climate that is somehow different than the rest of the world. We can't carve out a part of our country that's different from different in the pandemic from the rest of the island. Climate and pandemics, they are problems which are indivisible. We have to act collectively. We have to act collectively, think collectively. And the Bridgetown Initiative is a global plan. It's a plan for the planet to deal with climate change. And so, yes, it impacts us, but 3/4 of it doesn't impact us directly because it's about the rest of the world. And the rest of the world are often in a very different situation than us. I think all of us in Barbados, started becoming more conscious of the changing climate after that horrible 2017 hurricane season. Remember Maria and Irma, we had 2 Category 5 hurricanes. And those of us with family in other islands, and in my case, she was then opposition leader, but she encouraged me to go to Dominica. Mia Motley encouraged me to go to Dominica to try and support their recovery, their economic recovery from Hurricane Maria. And then I think it really dawned upon us what was happening with the climate and the fiscal problems. Over 50%, half of the increase of our debt in the past 20 years has related to dealing with the environment, dealing with the natural disaster costs. I'm talking about the region as a whole. And so we became much more conscious and realizing that we need to build resilience, and we need the world to change. We are canaries in the mine. We're watching the other canaries dying off, and either we try to fight for a bit of fresh air for ourselves, or we try and fix the mine. That's the only long-run solution. And so we began talking about that. Prime Minister Motley made some major speeches at the United Nations in 2021, at the end of 2021, a major speech at the COP, the Conference of Parties event, where all the countries come together to talk about climate, and people were excited about it. One of the main points that Prime Minister made is that people say climate change is difficult, it's costly, but we'd just come back from a global financial crisis, from a pandemic, and the rich countries had effectively printed $24 trillion of cash to buy their own bonds back from the marketplace, to buy their own bonds from their people. So in buying the bonds, they gave cash to the marketplace, and that helped to revive their economies and protect them from COVID. We weren't able to do that because we don't have a currency we can print without that causing huge economic problems. But they did that. The rich countries did that. $24 trillion. And the powerful message she made at the United Nations and at COP was that, if they hadn't just bought back any bonds, but they bought back government bonds that financed the green transformation, that financed mitigation and resilience against climate change, we would be halfway through defeating climate change already in just 10 years. So that this issue wasn't so much about money. We have the money. It's about political will. It's about focus, about decisiveness. So when she began making those statements, the public, the international community, they rallied to that. And so it occurred to us that there was something here we needed to build upon. And so the Prime Minister got together with the United Nations and with some of the philanthropists who are very involved in this area, some of the civil society movements and the non-government organizations, and some of the other countries who are climate vulnerable. And we had a meeting here in Barbados to really flesh out our plan. And then afterwards we published this plan, and we thought, here we are, a fairly small island, launching a global plan to save the planet. And we weren't sure this would go very far. We thought what would happen would be that other people would say, look at that plan. Why don't we launch our own plan? And that we would look at all these other plans, and we would take the best bits from other people's plans, and we'd make our plan even better. But we ended up being almost the only plan. And I think that's partly because, and one of the reasons why the Bridgetown Initiative has really got legs globally, is that we were trying to save the mine. We were trying to save the world. We weren't thinking about ourselves, because we knew that if we saved the mine, we would save ourselves. And that was the only way to save ourselves. Most other people have a plan that's only about them. And that doesn't work in climate. So the rich countries have a plan that's principally about them. Some of the poorest countries have a plan that's principally about them. We have a plan that's really about a pact that is a global response to this global problem. And I think that's why it has really stood out. And we've already started seeing some change. We've already started seeing some of the changes that we've asked for. Let me briefly describe the plan and then talk to you a bit about what's moving. So we need the world to transform, a green transformation. All the things we do need to be powered off renewable energy. Now, we know in Barbados solar, but of course there's wind, there's hydroelectric, there's waste to energy, there's biogas. We need to move our entire energy generation to a renewable space. We need to be focusing on producing things that don't cause great emissions in the atmosphere. That, it has been estimated, will cost $2 trillion. Now, when you get up after $1 billion, people find it hard in their minds to think 2,000 billion. I think the way to think about that is that all of the aid given to the poorest countries in the world on anything from water, from dealing with trying to address health problems, education problems, all of the aid in the entire world is $200 billion a year. So what we need for this green transformation is 10 times all of the aid in the world. It's a big number. And we've come up with a plan of how to get to that number. And the plan is basically saying, imagine 3 buckets. The first bucket, the biggest bucket, is a bucket of all those things in the green transformation that actually makes money. Things like a solar farm, or a wind farm, or a hydroelectric power station. And therefore, we don't need to use a lot of government money to fill that bucket. We need to find ways in which we can excite the private sector to be investing their cash in developing countries. And that is perhaps around providing some guarantees against risks. So we have a plan that will mean that people don't need to worry about foreign exchange risk, the value of the currencies going up and down, to drive private savings into energy generation. And that fills that bucket. That bucket's also got things like sustainable agriculture, shifting towards an agriculture which is not a using up the natural resources. And that also generates money. Sustainable agriculture makes money. We can get people involved in that without government money having to be spent to fill that bucket. Government money may be needed as a catalyst, as a trigger to excite the investment into those things. Second bucket, not as big as the first. This is about things for which there's no revenues, but there's savings. When we designed and built the upgrading culverts and the new drainage systems in Trents and Holtown, it helped to reduce some of the damage that we had from the regular flooding. It's still a difficult place, but we've reduced a lot of the damage. That means that we could borrow money to build those defenses and use the savings to pay back the borrowing. And so this next bucket is about let's find ways of borrowing cheaply to build resilience to climate change today. Not build resilience in 10 years' time. There's no point waiting 10 years. We need resilience today. And so the second bucket is about how the international development banks, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Caribbean Development Bank, how they can have the resources to lend to countries like ourselves 50-year money, not 10-year money, not 20-year money, 50-year money with very low rates of interest in order for us to build resilience. One of the things the Prime Minister says is that today, the average person in Barbados can borrow longer term for a mortgage than the government can borrow in the international markets in order to build resilience. And so we need long-term, low-cost money to fill that bucket. So now we've got all the things with the revenue, all the things with the savings, and there's a third bucket. We've kept that bucket as small as possible, but it's still the most difficult bucket to fill. No revenues, no savings. This is, what happens to a country after a devastating hurricane. This is reconstructing from loss and damage from climate. No revenues, no savings. You need to rebuild, especially low-income houses. You need to rebuild them. You need to spend money. And we're saying that bucket needs to be filled by the international community raising new money. Maybe that's new levies and new taxes. Maybe it's on the export of oil. Maybe it's on when ships emit lots of carbon, and there's a tax on those emissions. And we've come up with a couple taxes on those emissions, on those exports, that will fill that third bucket. So now we've filled the bucket with revenues, filled the bucket with savings, and filled that tiny, hard, not so tiny, but smaller, hard to fill bucket with some new taxes. And that is the Bridgetown initiative, with one other final thing. We believe that the global financial system needs to be we need to change the way it's set up, its design, its architecture, to be much more able to deal with shocks. We're now facing a world of more shocks. Climate change, devastating hurricanes, and the devastation, is not just about the power and speed of the wind. That hasn't changed very much. It's about how wet these hurricanes are. They come across the Atlantic, the warmer seas, they're carrying a lot more devastating water. And it is that devastation. And of course, climate change means a warmer, wetter climate. That is conducive to pandemics. Pandemics are caused by viruses. Viruses are spread by things like mosquitoes and other things which breed more strongly in a warmer, wetter climate. And so we're going to have more shocks. So we need a system that is more shock absorbing. Barbados is the world's largest issuer of something called natural disaster clauses. When we restructured our debts, you might recall, we basically had an exchange. We said, bring us the old bonds and we'll give you new bonds. And the new bonds all had these natural disaster clauses in them. and we have to thank our advisors for helping to design these. They were quite special. They weren't unique, but we've now become the largest issuer of these. And these mean that whenever there's a disaster, our debt servicing, our interest payments, our repayment of the debt, that pauses for 2 years, giving us breathing space, breathing room in order to deal with a disaster. In our case, it will provide us the space we need to recover, to reconstruct after natural disaster. And we're saying the whole world needs them. We already have them, so we are pushing something that we already have. The whole world having it won't benefit us, but our example can benefit the world. And so we think the world needs to be more shock absorbing, as well as having to fund these 3 buckets. And that is the Bridgetown initiative. And we've seen people like the system of finance, like this new architecture. They can understand it, they can grasp it, it makes sense. It is breaking down a big task into smaller parts that are achievable. And we found that our ambition has begun to move the ambition of the world. And we've already seen announced just in April that the multilateral development banks, the international development banks, are expanding the amount that they can lend. They need to do a lot more. They need to triple the amount that they lend. But they have increased, and we're hoping to keep that movement going so that we can get some more lending. And we've come up with some ideas on how to fill the bucket with revenues and how to fill the bucket with taxes. But that is the Bridgetown initiative. So let me talk a little bit further about debt and borrowing, because I know people are concerned about the amount of borrowing. And the challenge is, if we want to build a stronger seawall, that will cost a lot of money. And what do? Do we raise taxes today to build that seawall when it will benefit people for many, many years to come? So it makes sense to borrow that money today and pay the borrowing back with the savings from having built that stronger seawall, having built that more resilient runway at the airport. That actually leads to savings. And many times we borrow money that does not lead to savings as individuals, as consumers, with our credit card bill. This is quite different. This is borrowing to build infrastructure that is super resilient, that will save us money in the future. And of course, I also talked a bit about international taxes. And I need to make it very clear that we're not talking about raising Barbadian taxes. We're talking about the fact that there are many oil producers in the world, and we're saying that when they export their oil to the rest of the world, that we charge them a levy for the fact that the oil that they're exporting is contributing to the warmer climate. It's a little bit of the pollution pays principle, the polluter pays principle, that the contributors to these greenhouse gases need to pay a bit for the consequences of climate change. And if it encourages people to move out of oil towards solar and wind and renewables, that's a good thing too. So it raises revenues, but also pushes people into better things, more sustainable things. One of the challenges on climate change is that it's not something that moves in a straight line. There are various critical points. They're called tipping points. We move beyond this point, and it leads to changes in our climate, dramatic changes. The Earth is a physical system, a chemical system, and a biological system. Hundreds of years of pollution has put those systems under stress. We're now within spitting distance of the key trigger points in which those systems, the physical, biological, and chemical, begin to change in ways that will be very hard to move back. And that's why climate change is so important. We're already seeing changes in our climate because we've broken through some of these nearer tipping points. We haven't yet broken through the main tipping point. which is where the global temperatures rise by more than 1.5 degrees warmer. 1.5 degrees doesn't sound like a lot. In a day, temperature goes up and down, but it's an average temperature over a year going up by 1.5 degrees. Now we're within spitting distance of that. Now the impacts are not impacting the world in the same way. We are bang in the middle of a zone between, it's around 15 degrees north and south of the equator. This zone is the most climate vulnerable zone. It's where temperatures could rise to the highest level, sea levels will rise to the highest level. And that's why it is so much in our interest that the world does something about climate change. And not just pointing fingers at each other and saying, you should do more, you should do more. And the Bridgetown Initiative is a plan that, because we finance the change needed easily, they stop pointing the fingers and they get on with the job. And it's so important to us and the world that they do so.